Agatha Christie is one of the most well-known British authors for her famous detective murder mystery novels, and she certainly is one of my favourites. But Agatha also holds a secret real-life mystery of her own. On the night of December 3rd, 1926, at around 9:30 p.m, Agatha Christie went missing. She apparently had an argument with her husband, went to kiss her daughter goodnight, and then got in her car and left. She wouldn't be found for 11 days. Now, we know she was obviously alive and well, but they didn't know that at the time. The media went crazy, the public became amateur sleuths, and still to this day, her disappearance remains an unsolved mystery. But let's take it back a little to delve into what happened and the theories surrounding the disappearance of Mrs. Agatha Christie. She wrote her first detective novel in 1916, and by 1926 had published 6 of them. Her latest was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. By no means as popular or as famous as she is today, she was just about starting to make a name for herself. She was 36 at the time, married to Colonel Archibald Christie, who was a pilot in World War I, and they had a 7-year-old daughter, Rosalind. She was having quite a bad year. Her mother, whom she was very close with, had died, and she had discovered her husband was having an affair with a woman named Nancy Neal. He had asked her for a divorce just months before the incident. It was December 3rd of 1926. That night, Agatha got in her car at their home in Berkshire, England, and drove away into the distance. December 4th, the police found her car the next day, and Maurice Cowley crashed into the bush near Guildford by a chalk quarry. There was no evidence that she was injured in the accident, however she had left her coat in the car, which indicated that she must have left in a hurry. The disappearance of this relatively upcoming writer suddenly became front-page news around the country. Immediately the police began a search party, which was soon joined by 15,000 volunteer civilians. This search would span the next few days with no luck. They eventually would bring in bloodhounds and an aeroplane for the first time to assist in the search of this kind. One newspaper even offered a £100 reward for any evidence or sightings. With no luck from the land search, sites soon turned to a local lake, fearing the worst, but still no body was found. Some of her fellow mystery writers also got involved. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes books, was a believer in spiritualism, and he sought the help of a psychic and brought her Agatha's gloves. Dorothy L. Sayers went to the scene of her disappearance, searching for clues or any indication of where she would have gone. A few key clues developed over the next week, and things that could literally have been a clue or plot device from one of her own books. And I'd also like to specify that this is all according to newspapers and media releases, so we cannot credit the full reliability of these accounts or the reporters. The first and most telling is that it was discovered she had left 3 letters behind, one to her secretary, one to her brother-in-law, and the last to her husband. Only the one given to her secretary was given to the police. The only telling piece is that it states, "I must get away, I cannot stay here in Sunningdale much longer." That was what they called the house she lived in. And the one delivered to her brother-in-law was not handed over as it was destroyed, but he said that it was just stated she was going to a Yorkshire spa for some rest and treatment. And the letter to her own husband was also destroyed, but he refused to reveal any contents because it was a personal note, nothing to do with the bearing of her whereabouts. I will also say the word destroyed seems a little bit extreme, but in our paperless age it's kind of just like deleting a text. When you got a written letter in the mail, you'd commonly just throw it into the fire once you finished reading it. But I don't know if I would delete a text from a missing person if there wasn't something suspicious in it. During the search of the surrounding area, they found several small women's handbags, one similar to the one Mrs. Christie carried, one black handbag containing men's clothes and numerous documents, a bottle labelled poison, lead, and opium, fragments of a torn-up postcard, a woman's fur-lined coat, a box of face powder, one cardboard box, 2 children's books, and rather specifically the end of a loaf of bread. Now, with all these clues, amateur sleuths were keen to figure out what had happened to Agatha Christie, and if you have any theories, let me know. By December the 12th, concern was rising, as no one had reported any sightings, and so they began to publicly ask for help from motorists and amateur sleuths. It was also at this time that theories began to run wild. The secretary denied that it was a publicity stunt. It wasn't really like her, and speculated that she might be in London in disguise. Or was she even killed by her husband, him and his mistress Nancy Neal? The theory that she left behind a note to be opened when her body was discovered. December the 13th rolls around and spiritualists held seances on the spot, one medium coming to the conclusion that Mrs. Christie was dead. The public began to demand information on the letters that she left, based on fiction and theories, and really insisted that the police reveal more about the case. The police believed she had no intention of returning home. On December 14th, 10 days after her disappearance, they received their first tip. A woman had checked into the Swan Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, now the Old Swan Hotel. She had checked in as Teresa Neal from South Africa. Whilst there, she was lively and outgoing. She had joined in with the dances, entertainment, and socialite events at the hotel and in the town. But it didn't last long. Agatha Christie was recognised by a band member, who then tipped off the police to her whereabouts. The police and her husband confronted her at the hotel, where apparently she showed little recognition of her husband. She was unable to explain anything, how she got there and why. Loss of memory was given as the reasoning behind her actions, but there are still so many questions from the public. First of all, you may have noticed that she was, after all, at a Yorkshire spa, just as she told her brother-in-law in a letter. But if she didn't know where she was or how she got there due to a concussion, how was she able to send a letter to her brother-in-law explaining where she was heading? And perhaps even more suspicious was the identity she created for herself. Teresa Neal had clearly taken inspiration from her husband's mistress's name, Nancy Neal. On top of this, she had used the very same name to post an advert in the Times of London, asking for relatives to get in touch with her. After the incident, her husband denied any reason that she would have used that name, knowing full well that she was aware of Nancy's identity. He said that she had checked into a hotel with that name and placed an ad under that name because she believed it was her real name. The doctors told me such an action was compatible with that of a person suffering from loss of memory. Nancy's family also publicly denied knowing any reason that she would have used their family name, stating that Nancy herself was upset about it and that they have not the slightest reason why Nancy is associated with the disappearance. Despite their claims, I'm not fully convinced that this was purely a coincidence. As I said, the press had a field day with this story, making the most out of every ounce of information and creating the wildest theories to entertain readers. This story easily satisfied the desire for scandal, drama, and disaster. But let's discuss some of these theories. The first explanation is that Agatha may have hit her head in the accident, causing some concussion symptoms. She still managed to make her way to Yorkshire even though she may have lost her memory a little. But another theory is that she was more of a fugue state or a trance condition brought on by the trauma or perhaps depression. This is thought true since she adopted a new personality and didn't even recognize herself in the papers, nor seem to recognize her husband when they found her. Another theory goes that she was attempting suicide by driving in at the chalk quarry, but that night she thought she was turning into the pit but hit a bush instead. She was quite reflective of this in an interview with the Daily Mail 2 years later, but never went into too much detail. Her mother's death and her seemingly doomed marriage may have made her depressed. However, her personal life was just starting to take off with the success of her last publication. Perhaps the biggest theory is that this was a stunt for publicity. As I said, her last book was doing quite well, and the easiest way to stir up sales? Scandal, a tactic still used blatantly today. Almost immediately as soon as the news broke, Agatha's name remained in the papers, often snatching the front page headlines. Her fans and supporters all joined together to actively search for her, really becoming her first fan club gathering. In fact, this event really inspired quite a few amateur sleuths to get into the mystery genre itself, fancying themselves as the next Detective Poirot. And on top of this, there was a huge demand for her work due to the sensational disappearance, and people thinking that they could somehow crack the code through her published works. 2 newspapers published her novels as serials, and book publishers began rushing to publish all of her old works. Now, I couldn't find much information on any exact financial benefit this would have had, but I would assume it would have led to significant gain, both from sales but also popularity. In fact, as they made their way home, hundreds of people showed up at London train station to glimpse the couple as they got off the train. Her 7th book, The Big Four, was published just a few weeks after her reappearance, became a sales hit and doubled the success of her previous work. And no, she didn't write a whole novel in the span of a few weeks. In fact, her brother-in-law suggested compiling previous sketch stories into one novel in order to publish it quickly. These short stories first appeared in The Sketch magazine in 1924, and he helped her to revise them into one work rather than the pressure of compiling a new piece. Another theory is that Agatha knew what she was doing all along. Perhaps this was a whole elaborate plan to expose her husband's affair to the public. She created a mystery, scattered out the breadcrumbs, and simply waited for the story to break. She seemed to really have taken little effort to disguise herself other than the name, and must have expected at some point to be recognized. And surely there must have been a reason for her choice of pseudonym and the connection to her husband's affair. Or was there perhaps something even more suspicious going on, with the sneaking around, the staging of the car crash, and even more suspicious the personal or coded letters to her husband? Is it possible that Agatha Christie herself was setting up the framing of her own murder? That I will have to leave you to decide, but the public themselves were not too happy with the idea that this was all an elaborate setup, and there was almost a negative reaction to her being found alive. The sensational mystery got resolved but was never really officially solved. Agatha never really discusses the disappearance again, or really mention it at all in her autobiography published in 1977, a year after her death. In fact, she only glazed over her own divorce, which occurred 15 months after the incident on March 17th of 1928. She noted that there is no need to dwell on it. Both she and Archie went on to remarry, and Agatha Christie went on to write a total of 66 detective novels and 14 collections of short stories in her life. She became the best-selling novelist in history, and became the star of one of her only unsolved mysteries. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and as always, I will see you next time.